So I modified these color sliders. I said red, green, blue. I changed the colors. That allowed me to add the numbers, and that you see that the numbers actually update. Um, and 0 to 100, I think makes the most sense for a user to understand. That's what we're used to anyway. So let me take a look at my list. Yep, user interfaces and messing with the clock. So let me actually go through this all. I'm going to unclick play. So the clock here. If you remember, I'm going to go to, if I open it up, you see it like the face is one object, it has a material on it. We have like 12 of these hour indicators, and then we have the 3 hour hands underneath there. So it's actually quite a bit of objects to be clicking on. Um, so the easiest process I found was that, hey, look, I created 3 materials for the clock, a dark one, and if I change it, you'll see that it actually updates the clock face. Um, the actual face itself, and the red, the just a little, the second ticker. So I'm going to select all 3 of them, and I'm going to go back to what it used to be, which is the standard shader, which is actually a shader that gets impacted. If I click on the directional light and I move it, notice how the clock goes into shadow, goes into like fully illuminated, into fully dark right here. So if someone were to click play and it happened to be midnight in their time zone, or if they did set it to midnight, which we're going to get into later, you see that the clock would like completely disappear at that point. So that's not good. And it kind of separates it from the user interface. So we can go to these clock materials. I'm going to select all 3 at once. You can change multiple objects at a time, like one parameter on them. So in this case, I'm going to go from the standard shader to unlit color. Unlit color means just that it'll not be lit by any sources, just whatever the color is, that is the color that'll be put onto that 3D object. So as I zoom up here, I have the dark part, and I'm just going to leave it as black, and or maybe just a dark gray. You can put whatever you want. The clock face itself, I could leave it as white and it matches the rest. I think the rest of these seem to have just a little bit of mute to them, meaning just like a light gray, not complete white. So that kind of matches well. And then the red, I'm going to leave alone. So now my clock, if I go back to my light source, no matter where that light is, that clock, those 3D models will stay rendered the same. Will have the same material colors on them. So they act more like the user interface, not this environment that we're interacting with. Great. So next, let me move through. I messed around with the RGB first, so I'm going to close some stuff in the canvas. And I'm going to say I'm going to move from bottom up. So the blue slider, then we'll move to the green, the red. And I was going to do the same thing to the size, but it doesn't make much sense. Like numbers, like a full on for red, a full off for red, that still makes sense to an average person, an average consumer user of software. But as far as like the size, I don't think it made sense to put a number there because this size number is just arbitrary. I looked at the size slider and it's going from 0.1 to 2 with a default of 0.5. That's why it's a quarter of the way through by default. And that's just what felt right randomly to these things being spawned out in a certain distance from the camera. So this 0.1 to 2 doesn't really make sense to the end user. It'll make sense to the developers who kind of understand behind the scenes how this app was built and what's going on. But those details don't make any sense to the user, nor do they care, and it's just confusing. So I left size to just say size, and the position, or the relative position on the slider indicates how big the size of the paint stroke is. So this is saying it's a quarter the size that it could be, which is a half a unit out of 2 units, which is fine. In fact, since we changed the paint stroke to not just spawn objects, but to actually have these painted objects look at the object before it, and do this scaling feature where they're scaled based on the speed of the paint stroke. This actually size attribute doesn't really matter as much. It's actually only used when you first drop an object down. So if I make it really small, notice the first object I'm dropping down is super small, but when I'm moving the paint stroke, it doesn't impact it nearly as much. It's just that first object. And now when I move the paint stroke up, yes, it's that first object that's super big and the rest are not. So actually this kind of feature doesn't really make sense anymore since we went with this like distance parameter. So I'm going to have to work with them. They might be an either an or they're going to have to impact each other. I'm going to have to make those variables actually work in the math no matter which way the user selects to use the paint stroke. So I'm going to start from the bottom here. We got blue. So remember, if I open it up, all of this comes along for the ride when you create a UI element of type slider. This isn't. I wanted the slider to have a label. So if I turn this off, this is the slider. It was scaled, positioned over here, how big it is, and then the attributes, the min, max, and what type of scripts it should be impacting. This right here was just a button that I made a child and positioned it. And I remember I removed the button component. It's just an image now. And the reason for, I just want a nice little box. And this allows me to talk about now that you can change the color. So I'm going to unclick play. So if right now I have it colored as blue, but if I move the color around, you see that I can color it anything that I care to. So I'm going to undo. And this is the defunct button that I'm just acting as an image for right now. It's not interactable, and it's just an image, and you can mess around with the color on it. So underneath it was the label that came around with the button, and it used to say text, but I put a blue after it. So this is useful later on. I'll show you when you're connecting references to these game objects that you, even at this level, you still want to give some type of information what this is, not just text, because then there's all these other sliders and buttons that just say text underneath it, and when you're connecting to them, you don't know which text that's referring to. So in this case, it's the blue button's text, and by default it just says 100. So on this side, we're good. Let's look at the script. So here we went over how to deal with mouse position. So if I scroll down to the bottom of my update loop, here's mouse position.text, and this is how we understand the left, right, up and down position of the mouse. Now I'm going to add a few more. So blue amount, red amount, green amount, and I did add size amount, which I didn't end up using, and then eventually the timer amount, this 3-second. So let's just say, okay, blue amount. And if you saved it out, this script lives on the click detector. And now we have some more public variables exposed. This by, said none. So take a look at size amount, none, nothing's connected to it. So see how useful this is to read. Text blue, text red, text green. In fact, if I click on them, here's text blue, this text that lives underneath the blue slider. Click here. Text red lives underneath the red slider, and here text green lives underneath the green slider. And text timer underneath the toggle. But notice that if I didn't rename these, it would just say text, text, text. And yes, you can click on them and it will highlight them in the hierarchy so that you can see which UI element this belongs to. You just kind of move up the hierarchy here, and I can tell that this belongs to the green slider. But at a moment's notice, I can just look and see that, okay, these references make sense to me. The blue amount's connected to text blue, and so it just makes things easier in the long run. So anyway, I connected to this text element, this 100. I'm going to scroll down and just make a quick notice that you can change the color of text. So now we talked about changing image color, which was connected to that kind of non-active button. And this here, you can change the color of the text if you care to. So notice how everything's kind of black text on a white background. And even when I change this to red and green, the black reads really well. But I'm going to move this to black. And you notice we're getting black text on a dark blue background. It's kind of hard to read. So yeah, maybe I can move it up a little bit and make it like a mid gray and or light gray. Maybe it's easier to read. But for legibility, I decided to change this text to white, even though the rest of the text is black, so it kind of breaks the style, the consistency, which is kind of a no-no in graphic design. But legibility and usability always will trump aesthetics. So if we wanted to keep a black text, then I would more than likely have to go this color blue and kind of lighten it a little bit. So it's still saying, okay, this is blue, red, green, blue. Okay, we're talking about some type of color spectrum. I'm in a painting program. The only thing I can do is paint these objects. So probably these color attributes are connecting to that. And here's a blue. So that works. So either case, maybe lower the blue or keep the dark blue, but change the text to white. So in this case, let me see, I'll leave this to a light blue and see how that works. All right, and this text is what we want to mess with. So this public text is actually referring to this whole entire game object, or I'm sorry, actually it's referencing this text component here. So public text, it's UI engine, uniengine.ui, and it's this text component here. And now I think about, all right, when I'm dragging this slider, if I click here, and when I'm dragging the slider and updating this value, it's passing this value to this function. So if I come down here, this is the function that it's changing. And so what's happening? We're passing in this float, this temporary value, and we're setting our blue value to that. And then when we paint again, this is affecting our range of blues. If I come up here, we double click on blue. And when we actually create the color, this actually clamps down on our blues. All right. So I figured this might be a good area because every time we're actually interacting with the slider and what we're doing is changing this float on our click detector, which is affecting our color range for the objects we're spawning, I said, well, maybe now's a good time to change the value on my UI button. So what does this look like? Well, blue value, blue amount is referencing this game object's component right here, which is a UI text element. And if we say .text, we're actually changing this this section, this data member, and not any of these. So that should give you an indication that you should be able to grab the rest of these with code and change them if you care to. So we're just changing this text attribute here, and we're setting it equal to this. So our float amount goes from 0 to 1, and the only reason it goes from 0 to 1 is because this slider here goes from 0 to 1. That's the only one that's kind of overriding or dictating the range that this float can do. But I want to show the user a more user-friendly value. So instead of going from 0 to 1 or showing them a decimal, I want to show them 0 to 100. I want to show them an integer, basically. So to go from 0 to 1, to modify that range from 0 to 100, all we're going to do is take our float, which is always between 0 to 1, because that's how we set up our user interface slider. I'm going to multiply it by 100. Notice it's 100F. It's a float. So that we will always get a float of from 0 to 100. I do the toString to cast it as a string. So it's a text object. It can only read in a string. And I do this little naming convention. So this is basically how many decimals do we want. So if this was an F1, we get a one decimal number afterwards, and two, you get two decimal numbers, and so on. This says basically don't give me any decimal numbers. That's why it basically acts like an integer. So this is still a float. We're just casting it to a string basically that has truncated off the decimals and multiplied it by 100. So we get 0 to 100. So when we click play, this is just defaulting to 100. This slider is defaulting to 1. And as I update it, this slider is going to contact Click Position Manager. And it's going to call this this method. It's going to set this float. And it's going to go back and find another UI element, this time a text element, and go set this number to it. This is how we're getting this number updated. Like that. And as I move over here, notice we're going from 0 to 1, and over here we're going from 0 to 100. And this is the exact same case for slider green. We have a text called text green, set it to 100. In our script, you know about blue amount, red amount, green amount. And if I look at my click detector, here we have blue text, red text, green text. So we're aware of all these little text objects that we can change, and we change them whenever we manipulate the slider and we call a method. So when we're changing red, not only are we changing the red value, but we're changing that text and updating it here. Same for green, same for blue. All right, so that covers, I'm going to close these sliders up because that covered them. And let's see, we didn't do, remember I explained why I didn't change size. And this slider, which I've yet to update the name, so bad practice on my part, I call it slider timer. And I think I did this toggle here. Yeah, so underneath the toggle, it used to have this label, it was just this text. So I went down here and I just grabbed one of these buttons and just duplicated it and just moved that button up here into the toggle. And then I moved the button, up here. So that's how I got this button. And it said something else. It said size or 100 or something. But I basically just duplicated one of these buttons and then reparented them underneath my timer toggle, so I can reuse it. So it's an image. It's not interactive. It's not a real button. And the text on it I renamed to text timer, and I just said 3 seconds. So I said 3 because that's the actual default that we're having this timer to. So I'm going to go this label. I'm going to hide it. We don't use that anymore. So I got this toggle. I got this passive text element, and I have this slider here. So this slider is a little different than the others. I really minimized it down because it has less room to move in, and I figured it's also different than the colors and what have you, since it's going to be a whole number one. It's not like a full range, so you can feel it when you move it, that there's like distinct jumps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's not a continuous slider. We're only dealing with whole numbers. So to do that, I turn this on. If I turn this off, it'll be discrete. It'll go from 1 to 5 in a decimal or continuous format. And I set 1 to 5, and then I set the default to 3. The reason for is that 3 seconds felt like a good starting point. It was just long enough, and then it kind of wipes stuff off if you don't like it. And if you don't like that feature, you can turn off the timer. And I also wanted to kind of start in the center. And I know that less than 1 didn't make sense. Like 0 doesn't make sense. You would never see the stuff. It would just destroy immediately. So 1 is definitely the minimum. And I figure about 5 seconds is good, because more than that, like 10 seconds or something, you're getting more into like a permanent situation. So why not just turn off timer and just keep it permanent. So that's how I figured out the slider numbers. That's how I figured out the relative size of it. And this whole equation is, or this whole method is actually new because this wasn't set up at all the last time I had showed you this project. So this timer was created. What did I do is I added this timer amount. So I followed the same conventions as the others. They said we have a blue amount, a red amount, a green amount. I'm going to have a timer amount. I'm sorry, that was the text, right? So same convention, timer amount, but it's dealing with the text. Before we deal with the text, let's deal with the float here. I named it time to destroy, and I defaulted to 3 seconds, because that's what we found is defaulted well, and that's what our user interface defaults well to. If I double click it and move down here, this is where it gets placed or gets used. It used to be hard coded to 3F right here, 3 seconds. And so if we do use time destroy, we're going to destroy at a certain time, and instead of 3 now, we're using this variable. So where do we change it? Well, if somebody moves the slider, we're going to change this function, this change time to destroy. Pass in a temp, that float, change our time to destroy float, and then we're also going to change the actual text that gets displayed. So this time to destroy here, this text timer, I defaulted to 3 sec. It's more enough information to realize it's talking about seconds, and 3s are default. So if I go up here, this is what public text is, a timer amount. And that's what I update, timer amount dot text. Yes, this is the text component, but we're actually updating this little specific text data variable. And that's this one right here. We're set equal to time.destroy, our variable, dot toString. We're going to truncate off the decimals, and then we're going to concatenate it with another string, space second. So it's a number with a space and then say second. And I think the only thing I didn't show is that here, once you create that public text variable, it's going to ask for it, and I'm just linking it to this one here, this toggle time destroyer. Here's the text timer. And that's it. So when I click play, I can change the amount of seconds. So if a second is a 1 sec quick destroy, I'll do 5, switch over to 1. See, the 1 destroys, 5 second destroys, and I'll just turn off the timer. And now it just stays. And I either have to left click to destroy or clear it out. All right, so that combined with the other 2 tutorials on diagramming and user flows is more than enough for this week. Notice how my user interface is starting to get cleaned up nicely, and we're going to have to move on to more functionality next week.